In 1977, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling that most people have never heard of, and that ruling legally protected something that, if it happened in any American school today, would result in a criminal arrest before the end of the school day. That case was Ingraham v. Wright, and it didn't create a practice. It simply told the entire country that what had been happening in classrooms for over a century was constitutionally fine. That is where this story begins, not with nostalgia, with the loophole dressed up as a legal precedent. Picture a Tuesday morning in September 1973. You are 9 years old. You are sitting at a hard wooden desk, the kind that leaves red marks on your forearms if you lean too long. And at the front of the room, a teacher is holding a thick, flat leather strap. Nobody is whispering. Nobody is fidgeting. Nobody dares look up. That was school in 1970s America. Not a film, not a period drama, real classrooms, real fear. And a legal architecture specifically designed to keep it that way. By 1975, American public school enrollment had reached approximately 45 million children. That is nearly 1 in 5 people in the entire country, sitting in buildings that would fail every modern safety inspection placed in front of them today. To understand why, you have to understand what those buildings were actually made of, and what was happening inside the air those children were breathing every single day. Without anyone telling them to be concerned, let's start with the infrastructure. Because the physical environment of a 1970s American school was not simply old. It was chemically hostile in ways the scientific community was only beginning to quantify. The primary threat was asbestos, specifically chrysotile and amosite asbestos, which had been used extensively in school construction from the 1940s onward. Ceiling tiles, floor tiles, pipe insulation, boiler wrapping, wall panels. The material was valued for its fire resistance and its tensile strength. What was not publicly understood at the time was the danger posed by friable particulates, microscopic fibers released when asbestos-containing materials were disturbed, cut, or simply allowed to deteriorate with age. Children sitting beneath crumbling ceiling tiles were inhaling those fibers during spelling tests. The damage was cumulative, invisible, and took decades to manifest as mesothelioma and asbestosis in adults who had no idea they had been exposed as children. It was not until the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act of 1986, known as AHERA, that public schools were legally required to inspect for asbestos-containing materials and develop management plans. The inspection mandate came 11 years after those 45 million children had been sitting under those ceilings, and the damage, in many documented cases, had already been done. Alongside asbestos, many school buildings built before 1979 contained polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, in the ballasts of fluorescent lighting fixtures. The Environmental Protection Agency did not finalize its ban on PCB manufacturing until 1979 under the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. Before that, the flickering fluorescent lights that hummed above those rows of desks were, in a significant number of cases, leaching low-level chemical compounds into the air of enclosed classrooms, combined with the near-total absence of modern ventilation standards. The indoor air quality of a typical 1970s school building represents a chapter in environmental health history that rarely gets the forensic attention it deserves. Now add to that the socio-economic stratification baked into the daily ritual of lunchtime, and the picture of institutional harm becomes considerably more detailed. The National School Lunch Act expanded significantly in the early 1970s under the Nixon administration, reached approximately 27 million children by 1975. On the surface, that sounds like a success, and in terms of caloric access, it was, but the implementation created a visible, daily mechanism of class identification. Children receiving free or reduced-price lunches in many districts were issued a different colored ticket. They queued in a separate line. In some schools, they were processed at a different window entirely. The socioeconomic stratification was not incidental, it was structural, built into the physical choreography of a room that 500 children moved through every single day. The psychological literature on stigma formation in children suggests that repeated, public marking of poverty during developmental years produces measurable long-term effects on self-concept and academic confidence. In 1975, nobody was running that analysis. They were just handing out the colored tickets. Then there is the question of state-sanctioned corporal autonomy, or more precisely, the wholesale removal of it. The paddle in the principal's office was not a rogue practice. It was an institutionalized system with paperwork, witnesses, and, following Ingraham v. Wright, a constitutional seal of approval. The paddle itself, typically a flat piece of hardwood, 12 to 15 inches in length, sometimes with holes drilled through the face to reduce aerodynamic drag and increase impact velocity, was standard equipment in school offices across the American South and Midwest. Principals named them, they hung them on the wall. The Board of Education, Old Betsy, the naming was performative. It was a communication to every child who walked through that door about the nature of the power relationship they were entering. In the year 1975 alone, it is estimated that over 1.5 million students received physical punishment in American public schools. Not in secret, officially, as of 2023, 19 American states still permit corporal punishment in public schools. That number tends to require a moment of silence. What is equally significant, and far less discussed, is what Ingraham v. Wright actually said. The case originated in Dade County, Florida, where a student named James Ingraham received 20 paddle strikes for allegedly being slow to leave a school stage. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 that the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment did not apply to school children. The reasoning hinged on a distinction between penal institutions and educational ones. Schools, the majority argued, were community institutions subject to common law tort remedies, meaning if a parent believed their child had been excessively beaten, they could pursue a civil lawsuit. The practical effect of that reasoning, in communities where legal representation was economically inaccessible, was that it protected the paddle almost completely. The dissent, written by Justice Byron White, argued that the majority's position was incoherent, that the Constitution offered more protection to convicted criminals than to 9-year-old students, that dissent did not prevail, but it has aged considerably better than the majority opinion. Beyond the legal architecture of harm, there were the quieter exclusions, the ones that operated through omission rather than force. Before the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, later reauthorized as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, public schools in the United States had no federal obligation to educate children with physical or cognitive disabilities. Some districts made provisions, many did not. Families were told, in explicit terms, that their child could not be accommodated and that they should seek alternative arrangements. The word alternative in that context carried a weight that is difficult to overstate. It meant institutions, It meant segregation by ability. It meant that the promise of public education did not, in practice, extend to a significant portion of the child population. The 1975 Act changed that framework fundamentally, but only after an entire generation of disabled children had already been turned away at the door. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 was reshaping a different kind of exclusion simultaneously. Prior to Title X, girls in American public schools face systematic barriers in athletics, academic programs, and institutional resource allocation that were so deeply normalized they were often invisible. The practical transformation was measurable. Between 1972 and 1978, female participation in high school athletic programs rose from 294,000 to over 2 million students. That is not a marginal adjustment, that is a structural redefinition of who the school building was for. The implementation was contested at every level: school boards, coaching staffs, facility allocation committees. The resistance was not always subtle, but the numbers tell the story more clearly than any deposition. And yet, within and alongside all of this, the asbestos, the paddles, the colored tickets, the exclusions, there was something else entirely. 3:15 in the afternoon, the doors opened, and for the children who walked out, there was a quality of freedom that is genuinely difficult to translate into the language of 2026. You walked home, sometimes a mile, sometimes more, through parks, through lots, past 7-Eleven where 35 cents bought you a Slurpee that came in a color nature had never produced. You carried your marble composition notebook, that black and white speckled cover, 30 cents at Woolworths, tucked under your arm, because backpacks were still, somehow, considered camping equipment. The world was small, your street was the whole world, and for approximately 18 hours, nobody with institutional authority was going to tell you to sit still. By December 1979, the American Academy of Pediatrics had begun formally tracking what researchers would later call the long-term decline of unstructured outdoor play. But in 1975, in most of America, it was still the default condition of childhood. From the final bell until the streetlights came on, no mobile phones, no location tracking, no app sending a notification to a parent's wrist, just the slow, golden compression of an afternoon, and the particular mathematics of how far you could wander and still make it home before dark. The institutions were imperfect. In some cases, they were genuinely and documentably harmful. The legislative corrections that followed, AHERA in 1986, IDEA in its various reauthorizations, the gradual state-by-state prohibition of corporal punishment, the EPA SPCB restrictions. Those laws exist because real children were harmed by the conditions that preceded them. That is not a romantic footnote, that is the actual record. But the children who came out the other side carry something that the legislative record does not fully capture. They remember the smell of floor wax and chalk dust. They remember the clanging of radiators and the specific weight of a metal lunchbox. A Star Wars lunchbox after 1977 changed everything, or a Dukes of Hazzard one, or a plaid thermosan box set that always smelled of yesterday's soup. They remember a walk home through the long afternoon light that felt, in the way that only childhood can manufacture, like the whole world had been built just for them. We had less, in some ways, significantly less. But somehow, and this is the part that resists easy analysis, it felt like more. That is not an argument against progress. It is not a case for bringing back the paddle or the asbestos ceiling tiles or the colored lunch tickets. It is simply an honest accounting of what was lost alongside what was corrected. And an honest accounting is, in the end, the only kind worth giving.